Okay, welcome back. Thank you to Stephen J., Linda, Jen, Lauren K., and Adra Brown for your really nice contributions. Three of which are recurring, and I know I've seen you before, Adra. Thank you so much, guys. And Stephen, I wanted to just say I do wish you well, and hope you're doing better since we last spoke. All right. I'm going to be talking about to Paul Lee today. Two different issues come up, but they're slightly related. And I figured I should just cover it. Paul's been very communicative, and I'm really, I really, I want to say I want to reward it, but I maybe I do. But I'm very pleased to have that conversation. And these several conversations, these several points, to the extent that and it sounds like he's a person who's working on the problem. And so to the extent that this stuff can be helpful, I really want to be there. So let's start with, let's see, which one do I start with? I got to look at this for a second. Let me read the one I was going to read first, and you'll see what the larger picture is. And then I'm going to talk about the second one. Talk about the second one first, okay? The second. So he's got two fairly several sentence long queries. I wonder what the import of this question might be when you consider the shop talk that said, "Always be designing," or something to that effect. And I'm sorry, I can't go back and pull up the reference, what he's talking about, but we're going to get ahead of that anyway. Who was it that said that? Gammell, perhaps. It was actually Benson, and I'm going to share the quotes with you. And I'm going to tell you now that Benson's advice to his daughter is available through me, some fairly adequate version of it with a few typos and things. But it is one of the best pieces of writing that communicates the ideas that I'm talking about regarding the Boston School. There's very little else. Even the 24 sittings with Tarbell doesn't convey even close to what the advice to his daughter does by Benson. So anyway, that's who said that. In what sense was that said, always be designing? I take it that in the Boston School methodology, we're largely talking about the right color, hue, value, chroma, with the right shape, edges in the right spot. But if that's the case, and to your point about posing the sitter, et cetera, in the setup, and so you know what that's from, right? I'm saying if you're trying to get the sitter to speak, to actually say something about the sitter, pose him until he does. Do you see that's what's coming forth? And then your job is a fairly simple one, a relatively more simple one, shall we say. That's when it says speak, I mean when you want it to communicate something about the sitter in particular. So how are we to be always designing? Have I got that quote correct? But before I talk about that, Paul, I'm going to talk about this one. I'm wondering if your approach differs from setting up in the studio versus plein air. Now, when I talk about composing or the always composing thing, there is obviously in any kind of composition that need to be always there and improving your composition, right? Which is what always composing significantly means. But it's to the imaginative painter, that's sort of all you do. You have to create the entire apparatus. Whereas when you're painting from life, painting a portrait, painting landscape, those in particular, you are or well, let me just say all three of them, or doing a still life or an interior. You have some opportunity to arrange things, and then you have what's the best way to say it? Then you have a need to frame it into a composition, and then to begin to understand your composition. And that's really where I want to lean today. But so he says, does the use of viewfinders or some strategy like that factor in, besides for composition? So that isn't really clear what you mean there, but let's just go with it. For instance, exits would not be readily apparent unless you have a very clear composition in mind, even in the setup and use of the viewfinder. So I can imagine that selection of the rectangle, aka the canvas, is immensely important in the way of working, including the importance of site, size, location of the setup. So you see, this is a whole different discussion in a way. There is something important about setting up so that you're not too close to your canvas. Now, site size is a thing where and some people call it, what do they call it, natural size or something? I forget who said that, but one of you guys, where you're drawing at such a size that it appears to be the same size. It's just a natural thing to do. When you see Michelangelo's little drawings, you might assume that he was drawing rather on his lap or just in front of him like this, because some of these drawings are just so small. The whole figure drawings are so small. Other ones are bigger, which would imply that he was sitting back further. But about the rectangle, though, the composition, when you're painting as an impressionist, which is really this entire discussion here now, we're talking Boston School thinking. When you're painting as an impressionist, the rectangle, or any other composition too, of course, the rectangle's the thing. Everything that's about composition is about what's happening in that rectangle. So what's happening inside the canvas would just be another way of talking about it. But what we're doing by necessity is resorting to the rectangle to find the composition. Now, one thing I didn't talk about, I may have talked about somewhere along the way, is one of the things we did with Gammell that was really strategic was he would have you do a drawing of whatever was sitting in front of you on a great board, right? And then he would have you strip pieces, put strips around it to form a frame. And then he would have you adjust the frame this way and that way, different proportions, different locations for the center of interest, and begin to explore how higher, how lower, and you begin to explore the very nature of composition through a rectangle. And so you have it already 2D in a drawing in front of you. And I thought one of the most remarkable things was this willingness on his part to have you explore it, try it this way, try it that way, and begin to find the composition. Well, that begins a real good search for composition that then plays out really well with the viewfinder itself when you start painting outdoors or something like that. And you don't take that kind of an approach. You still could, by the way, in theory. And in fact, when I show you the drawings, my landscape drawings, the little tiny ones, that's exactly what I did do. I went out there and did drawing, and then I held this little viewfinder up. I held it up, that is to say, to the drawing and moved it around until I found the drawing I liked, and then I drew a line around it. And then I finished the composition that way. But composition does require a rectangle. I just wanted to say that. So let me go back to this and see if I can clean up anything I have undoubted. I notice I do pick up on certain aspects of your questions and not necessarily all of it, and maybe from your point of view, not enough of it. So I do hope you'll come back if it comes to that. So Paul again says, I'm wondering if your approach differs from setting up in the studio versus plein air. Setting up in the studio always gives you that chance to move. You can't move trees around. You can't move the barn. You could move the car if you're painting a car in the barn, or the woods or whatever. And you can tell people where to go stand, if you're going to use them in a composition outdoors. So that's your opportunity to change something. But after that, it's all the viewfinder. And of course, even before that, the viewfinder can be involved. My primary concern when I'm setting up a still life composition or interior is to find out to observe what will be the center of interest in this thing, and to start a framing thing, that's a viewfinder thought about it and wonder about what then else has to also come into play. And that's even more, shall we say, important in a still life. So you could say that if you want to go back to that question about always composing, everything you do that has anything to do with controlling the setup is composing. It's not, and so is composing, by the way, just doing, I'm not going to talk about this much, but just composing figures. You get 2 or 3 figures to stand around and do the right thing in an imaginative picture, you're composing. Of course you are. and how far the next grouping is away, and what pattern it makes in relation to the other one. All this stuff is composing. But when you're outdoors, composition, it's better to understand composition by experiment, you know. And then when you're going outdoors and by the way, it's always both and. You have to experience everything to begin to especially to be reasonably okay at going outdoors and just finding that view that really composes well. And I say compose as well. Isn't that interesting? So there's a view that you're going to take, and I'm recommending that you take no more in than this. But there's a thing you can do going out there. By the way, this is what I call the rule of thumbs. If you haven't heard of this before, because most people's thumbs, this distance, if they put their thumbs out like that, that's distance right here, is very close to 3 times that distance to your eye. And you're just wise not to take it any more than that. You can take it less. You can make this square smaller in this way. But so I'm saying that if you take that kind of a view, you should be able to look out there and be able to pre-picture this as if it was a finished picture in a frame. You should be able to move the center of interest back and forth, orient the spot, so you really are getting a fun composition. Now, having said that, this whole question of exits, you're going to have exits, okay? And now if you're using a real viewfinder, that has a boundary all the way around it, you're going to be able to see where they are, which tree is cutting off in just such and such a place. Just a week or two ago, I showed you a start by Benson. I could have showed it again today, but it has exits built into it. There's some trees maybe going out the top or something like that. And of course, those are very useful landmarks when you're beginning to make marks onto your canvas. Those kinds of things really help you to orient, so you know what not to include in the painting would be a good way to say it. Yeah, so looking through the viewfinder, you do have a clear composition in mind. So I don't know if I can say more about that, but our main point I'm going to have to get back to and keep plowing through this, okay? So I could imagine that selection of the rectangle, aka the canvas, is immensely important in the way of working, including importance of site size. Well, certainly that's covered then, okay? You do want to be able to change the proportions of this thing. Not just, by the way, if you go out with a canvas of such and such a size, that's what you're going to use for a viewfinder. If it's a 9x12, you're going to have a 3x4 frame, say, or something like that, and you're going to look through that. It's going to be the same proportion. The only option you have is to turn it vertical or turn it horizontal. And then, of course, to move it left or right or up or down. But if you want more control, if you're not sure about what you've taken out there for a panel, one of the things I do in any case is I go out there with a panel and even some tape sometimes, and I tape off the size I want, but I do a preliminary study that's very small, no bigger than 5x7. And I can change that proportion by taping off the panel if I want to right there on the spot, which means that then when I go back in, I can stretch a canvas for the next time out. Okay, so I don't know how much that's too much information, but let's just go to the Benson thing. So let's go back. Let's look at this statement. I wonder what the import of this question might be when you're considering the shop talk, always be designing. Who was it that said that, and what sense was it said? Okay, and that's where I want to go today. What does it mean? I take it that in the Boston School of Methodology, we're largely talking about the right color, hue, value, shape, edge, the right spot. But if that's the case, and to your point about posing the sitter, et cetera, how are we to be always designing? So that would be the concern that comes up. And I'm going to read you a Benson quote. He said, he's talking about if you're just painting realistically, if you think that everything we're doing out there is just copying what we see in front of us, then you're going to miss the boat, okay? Here's my first Benson quote. You'll never get what you are after until you arrive at the purpose that's behind it. You have a certain sense of design, but you don't use it. He's talking to his daughter. But you don't use it when you sit down before a landscape. You try to paint what you've seen other people do and make it look like rocks and trees instead of using it as a design. The great value of simplification in design is something you don't yet understand. And I've shown you that in those lay-ins by our guys. People who write about painting rarely know what a painter is trying to do. It doesn't matter whether you use landscapes or birds or people. Try to fill your space with the best possible pattern. Only intuition will tell you what is right. Men have tried to do it by mathematics. The Greeks had a feeling for it like no other people since. The Greeks had a feeling for it. He's not going to say the Greeks had a feeling for mathematics. He had a feeling for the design. But that's a fascinating thing for him to have said in the light of the dynamic symmetry conversation that's gone on before. So what Benson is saying is when you're looking through this rectangle, the whole thing is, do you have a great abstraction? And he uses the word pattern. I'll talk about that in a minute. But does it create a great pattern on a 2D frame? Pattern. I mean, it's just an abstraction of data and the way it interplays with itself. And that's a large word for pattern, or pattern is a word, that you could extend to mean that and much more. All right. So let's look at the second one. That's the first one. Good painting, representation of objects, is utterly useless unless there's a good design. So you see how that's where you have this need to get in there and actually put together a great abstraction, including looking through a viewfinder to see if it really is one as best you can. Get an idea of it through the viewfinder. And including, talking about making sure you use the viewfinder in a way that allows you to try different proportions of the canvas. That was one of the things I found really liberating with Gammell, was that we would actually we would do a drawing, crop it without even thinking about the proportions. And as I say, without thinking about trying to match some proportions, like a 9x12 or something. And then we would stretch the canvas to exactly, or, to the next size up, exactly what we had by happenstance and by preference in terms of what beauty it gave to the composition. We would stretch a canvas to whatever that was. Now, it does set you up to have your frames made custom, but they're not much less expensive if you're talking gold leaf frames, custom anyway, standard sizes. Every once in a while you get good deals that way. But anyway, so good painting, representation of objects, is utterly useless unless there's a good design. That's the whole object of painting. And unless you can think in those terms, you'll never be a good painter. Now, this is where you're starting to realize you're bridging the idea of music. And he talks at some length in this thing I'm trying to get you to guys ask me for, the advice to his daughters. He talks about an interview with Loeffler, the violinist in Boston. It's very enlightening. And I've covered it before in other places. But that's why painting is bad for you, except as practice and representation. You'll not learn to be a good painter by doing portraits. You're too much interested in an eye or a nose and the likeness. You should look at a landscape. Here's a way to get yourself in the right frame of mind, as if you were going to decorate a plate. To make a pattern that would successfully decorate that plate and use the landscape before you to do it. Now, you see the implication of the two-dimensionality of a plate is obviously already a pattern. Why is he talking about those two things? And what does he mean by plate? So I'm going to go and talk to you about, well, let's just go down and talk about pattern and a plate. The Greeks, he's already mentioned the Greeks. They intuitively, this isn't done by mathematics. This is done with the eyes, and this is intuition. But look at the entertainment value of the patterns created here by just dark and light shape. Right? Now, there's so many things about this that, I don't even know where to begin talking about the fun of this thing, but just look at it without closing in on it. This is one of those things where you don't need a big phone to look at this. You can see better, actually, the smaller it is on your iPhone or whatever you have. But you can see the distribution of the spots. It's very entertaining. The types of spots, the great variety of the types of spots, and even the way they talk to each other. See like the arcs talking, even this thing coming back to an arc, or you can talk about this double one over here. There's a whole sequence of these kinds of sort of what you might call rhymes and rhythms. And look at the entertainment value of the legs talking into the shin guards back to the other legs. That's just, look how entertaining that is. And notice how that relates to these guys up in through here. Now, this is the pattern. This is the class of what he means by pattern, right? So, the shape entertainment, this thing here, and the way it plays to things like this, or any other aspects of shapiness. You know, we're talking about all sorts of levels of entertainment, right? So when he says pattern, when Benson says pattern, and he's visited this, and he goes to this, you can begin to make sense of it. Let's make this pattern here. Let's take this. It's more like a plate, isn't it? But this is what Benson is talking about when he says pattern. Can you make me an interesting pattern? Well, it's pattern. It's darks on lights in this case. In this case, here's its darks, lights, and middle tones, right? They're making patterns. The lights in the middle tones are making patterns. Or you say the middle tones spotted on the lighter thing makes a pattern, and the dark spotted on all that together is making its own patterns. And so this is where you have to begin to wake up to the idea of composition, to main lines, and what gives unity to a composition. You can notice the variety thing is always there. Big blobs, different sort of grassy, blobby things, big pattern, flat patterny things, and then all the bird shapes, all done in different sizes. You get everything from a little teeny piece of a head to bigger, and then combinations of things that make, so that all the spots are done with variety, always trying to do it with interest, and of course with expression, so the birds look like they're up to something and they're trying to land in the water or whatever. This does look like the work of somebody who put some time in out there. Now, but the point is, are you composing all the time? So you can see that even if you've done this, you have to make these patterns work. So you're going to have to do some trial and error. Even while the job is to just fill the sky with birds, you have to have an idea initially, the spotting idea, if you want to just call it that. This idea gradually comes to you and you reinforce it, right? The idea of the gradient distribution, it's forming this great sweeping thing that seems to want to churn out this way. You see something like this in Ruysdael, in Van Ruysdael, the Dutch. Nevertheless, you can begin to grasp what he means here. And so, but pattern is something you have to keep working on right through the painting. Now I'm going to talk about other aspects of that, but let me just go back here. So this was to emphasize again the fact that it's in the composition, the design, the creation of the artist's mind, which is important, not the representation of objects with paint. I grew up with a generation of art students. I probably should end with this one, but it's in here. Who believed that it was actually immoral to depart in any way from nature when you were painting. It was not till after I was 30 and had been working seriously for more than 10 years that it came to me, the idea that the design was what mattered. And again, I'm telling you, it's that music. It's two-dimensional music. It seemed like an inspiration from heaven. I gave up the stupid canvas I was working on and sent the model home. So some men never discovered this. And it's to this that I lay the fact of such success as I've had. Few people in general have a sense of beauty and know when things are right. They don't know that they have, but they recognize it in great painting, and design is the only thing that matters. Anyway, let's just talk about various aspects of design. I'll give you one more thing. Let's see what that is. Benson says, and this is the quote, Paul, that you were actually talking about, "You'll always get into trouble unless you design all the time you're painting. Stop designing and you're in trouble. You're so fascinated with painting, with making the things to look like reality, that you forget to design. The things themselves should be made only at the very end. Till then, concentrate only on the values and relations of color and space." So I'm going to just show you some things. So when you're talking about Ang, when we were doing portraits, I referred to you to the idea of the movable feast, and you can see the drapery is one of those things. Hair is another one. The model comes in and the hair will change. And I don't really think you want to set up a wig for your sitter. You can, you could in theory. Begins to be a dubious exercise from the point of view of that aspect of your truth to the model. But from the point of view of design, it might have been. Ang, by the way, used to talk negatively about using the lay figure to set up your drapery. He was found to have done it. People would find in his studio he had some drapery set up on the edge of the balustrade or something like that, a staircase, where he was then drawing using that, organizing the folds, right? Well, I'm bringing this one up because Sergeant, well, Mr. Gammell, the man I studied with most extendedly, shall we say, at least from the point of view of the depth of what we're talking about, was talking about the portrait we were working on. And he would, and there were little folds in the corner of the sleeves and other places. And he would talk about, he would say, you need to design those folds. So that's one of those places in which you're talking about designing. Now, the model would come and go, the model would come and go, and to whatever extent that you'd see things consistently over time, you'd say, okay, I can see how that would design. You're looking at the folds as sets of folds. Like you might be finding an area like this that's very intriguing to you. You love the way this does this. And then you find out it picks up something else, or maybe it picks up this great line down here. And yet this is the designing that will happen in the course of your understanding your sitting, right? That's funny that I'm talking about portrait. Some people would be pushing away from that, but it's the same thing in a landscape, that you're going to be continuously, and this is probably the best way to think of it, you're going to be continuously exploring that thing which you have selected, a priori saying, I recognize you, I see there's something special here. You've done all this looking through your viewfinder, and you're going to be spending time now, the whole rest of the painting, trying to understand the composition and to play it out. You know, you're going to start noticing the blue game, the distribution of these blues throughout this picture. You're going to start seeing the variations in blues. You're going to start seeing that that's a thing. And don't you see, Paul, how that then begins to be what we call the extended composition? It's not that it wasn't there already. It's mostly there already. It shouldn't have to change things dramatically. But when something does change, I was painting a pastoral painting, and there was a fence and some cows and that sort of stuff. And I came back 2 days later, or whatever it was, the next possible good day, and the farmer had taken down the entire fence. It was completely gone. I don't mean that, and I can't tell you I actually saw that there was anything left. My composition did depend on that fence being there. But the drapery on this model's head, that's going to do all sorts of interesting things. And your job is you've selected a pose with the model, everything about her hands and all that sort of stuff has already been selected. You're trying to do this, something is already happening, but you're going to spend a ton of time designing it. And you're going to have a reason to have this thing going out just that far. That has to do with the things that are given in the pose of the model. The things that are the first things. The first thing might be you set the model, almost like Madame Récamier, the David painting. You set her out here on this couch where she's leaning off to the right. It's all been pre-decided. And again, if you look at that one by John Way Alexander, there's numbers of them, but one in particular with the woman stretched out on the couch. You can see how he's got this beautiful abstraction in mind, but you still have to bring it home by making all the lines in it conform, by getting them lined up so that they actually talk to each other and form rhythmic repetitions and things like that. There's a lot to be done. You can, as I was saying before, in the landscape that we were looking at with Benson, this guy could have done anything. He came out there. I don't know at what point he realized the clouds, what they were doing and how useful they were to him. The one thing that seems to have been given was this location, this kind of stuff right here. Probably he was looking out there, placing this thing and liking that spot. And then knowing he was going to have the problem of then organizing the birds, but then also of organizing the minor play. I say minor only because it's slightly weaker in contrast of these abstractions here. Now you go out there with a cloudy sky and it's going to move on you anyway. So you would say you don't have a choice, but what you really do is you have endless choice in designing with it, right? So you begin to see, the things that are given, and then those things that you have to toy with that are going to extend your design, or, as I say, bring it home, it's going to finalize it. But it has to do with, once you're writing a poem, you have to realize what the rhyme scheme is that you're in. Shall we call it rhyming poems? Or whatever else it might be. But you have to realize what world you're in, and you have to maintain the unity with that world. So who knows how much, what this, what was I said were the givens for this thing. And he said, I like this, I like that. He had something in mind. He'd been out there many times before. So who knows, he may have had all this in mind here, knowing that he was probably going to put the birds up in here. So he may have had this entire thing organized based on little decoys sitting on the ground. But, you know, he wasn't going to go out there and start changing the locations of stuff. Now, it doesn't mean that he couldn't have moved some of this down or emphasized different things. The question of emphasis is another one. And I say that meaning if you actually are putting lights in through here and here that aren't consistently there in every picture, then you're doing it intentionally. So the reason you have this here or this one right here, setting against the dark, creating silhouettes, has everything to do with where you want the eye to move. So the eye will pick up more strongly high contrast things. So you'll notice those points, those events. This area right here becomes one of those events. Well, that's organizing your composition. That's continuous designing, right? Let's go back to the question again. I'll talk about Chloe in a second. So you'll always get in trouble unless you design all the time you're painting. I think I'm covering it already. I think I've pretty well covered it. But this one, the question of the sense of beauty, for people in general have a sense of beauty and know when things are right. That's one of those things that really does rather matter. That you go out there and find a spot that's essentially beautiful. And don't be going out there and just taking some random thing. I mean, I don't want you to search the rest of your natural life, but you know, Sargent had such a gift, shall we say, or such an experience at recognizing it, that he was able to do a spot almost anywhere, and that will be the case more and more. You'll be able to stand at any spot and find something that's got it, and you'll then take on that little segment of whatever it is, figure out how to spot it, how to place the essential pattern, the beginning of the pattern, and then the variables will come into play following that. But you have to see it as already some sort of an idea in a rectangle, right? And there's some essential thing that's there that's given that you're going to rely on, that you're going to lean on, and then you're going to keep on reeling it in. So that has to do with changing, you know, if you're doing a poem, and it would have to do with, instead of having a 3-syllable word, you're going to change it to a 2-syllable word because of the way it goes with the previous sentence. That sort of thing. Doesn't mean you're going to change the meaning of anything or anything like that. So always getting into trouble unless you design all the time you're painting. So that means don't let the realism take over. That's all it means. I'm just going to give you this as a whatever. I've talked about this before, maybe even composition, but it's one of those compositions. I was doing a portrait. My daughter came with a really fun hat, and we went and dug up some things. She had this really cool dress. We threw a sweater on her, and before we knew it, we had a really fun abstraction. And I would say, hey, Chloe, thank you very much. She had an inclination to sit for me briefly, but she was never inclined to sit long. For this portrait, she sat long. She was very intrigued along with me. But I'll give you just a couple examples. We'd bought a book together of the Hubble telescope shots, a big old book full of these beautiful, beautiful shots of different things. And this in the background here is a star being born, which intrigued me. You know, it just amused me. Everybody who's got a daughter thinks of a star being born or a son, and but probably more of a daughter to a father. But so that was just, you know, so there's a reason for doing that. But I was interested in just putting in a false background, you know, having a really fun design and then finding something in the Hubble book just to make a connection between the two of us for that time. And so you can see that all the rest of these things here are various nebula and other kinds of star formations that were happening outside. So I've taken things that might have been sequins or stars in the sky, and I placed them, and all that placement is an attempt at a design idea, right? And but it has that combination of their sequence. But you see how the pattern thing takes over from the sequin. This could be just a pin on her dress, but it's actually just another, in this black sky through the night, you know, out looking deep into the sky through a Hubble telescope, you're finding so many of these very fascinating little patterns that are the nebula. What a world God's created. Staggering beyond belief. But after a little while, I began to realize between that hat and this abstraction down here, I was beginning to think an hourglass, but it was even more twisted than that. And I began to notice the DNA pattern or something with a little more complexity to it that I've been looking at fairly recently in that. And so I had that in mind. You see what I mean? So there's an essential something there. So everything else I was doing was trying to listen to that essential something, which is just sort of summed up in this abstraction, right? Just the irregularity, but the unity of that abstraction swirling out that way. And I do believe, by the way, that patterning doesn't have to be flat in your mind. It just has to be good flat on the panel. But I sometimes find a three-dimensional thing, and I've talked about that in the composition stuff I do. And if anybody ever, by the way, would like me to do a composition class near them, let me know. We can do that workshop. But this is a this is a thing that is not infrequent in the harmonizing, but more what enables you to harmonize if you have, as C.S. Lewis said about his Narnia series, he had a vision, an image of a fawn with an umbrella. And what I'm trying to do here is I just had a harmonizing idea, like something complex and twisting. DNA. So I just let it sit there. I wasn't trying to copy DNA or anything like that. It was just gave me an idea about what I should and shouldn't do. I wanted to reinforce and continue that idea, which is what I call reeling it in. But it eventually got right down to the earrings she was wearing. And I kept looking for, can you give me some other earrings, some other earrings? And maybe she'd come in with these in the beginning, but I didn't have them turned right. And finally I got them turned right so that they actually begin to resemble the irregular pattern itself of either the DNA or a nebula in the sky or et cetera, et cetera. And that's always composing. That's all we mean by always composing. So, Paul, I'm hoping that it begins to get you there. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I might say. Did I have another image? Um, yeah, no, that's it. Um, so yeah, back to the question. Look at the Greeks. This is Ang talking to you, looking at the Greeks. But certain of these Greek plates are just so there. The grasp of a who's thinking plate maker. But the grasp of the idea of pictorial abstractions, and the delight, what I'd call the music. This is one of those things where you don't know, you got a thing here that is the mail. It's like something like chainmail, but you don't realize that you got a variation on chainmail here unless you've been in the game long enough. And other variations you might call variations on chainmail in other places, variations. Uh, so not just the curves I was talking about. So to get to be aware of those things and then to place them with good timing and all that sort of stuff, it requires you to have patience about everything being composition from the very beginning. Just be patient to bring out the composition, to dig out. So as I'm saying, composition sits there. I mean, nature sits there in front of you. And if you've done your job of observing it, and if you found something that actually has intrigue in it, by the way, it's got to have beauty and it's got to have interest, which is intrigue, all those kinds of things. It's got to be interesting, and it's got to somehow hang together in a way that you can't even name. Then your job is to sit there and explore it and draw forth, okay? That's what you're doing through the entire painting. You're drawing forth the composition, okay? Um, yeah. There's so many directions this can go when you start talking about imaginative work. And this would be imaginative work, by the way. But but you have, in a sense, when you're doing this, you might say you have more options about what you're going to do. It's like he's looking at his wardrobe, doesn't it? This warrior and his assistant there. Um, in any case, no matter what you put in, it doesn't matter whether it's a straight line like this and how it relates to other straight lines like this, or what other ones show up, whether it has to do with the dance of legs. You're always trying to improve it. One of these things you'll notice by these guys is there are always great variety in these negative shapes, in these patterns. The legs, no two legs are the same. You're not boring me to death. You're being interesting. And the pattern. So this is what you call pattern as well, right? So this larger thing, there's a pattern created in this rectangle, and it's amusing, most amusing pattern. And then there's patterning in the sense of look at 6 of them in a row, and now you're talking what you see Degas doing not infrequently with the dancer's legs as well. So I have a suspicion that this is one of those places where you don't throw out the baby. The antiquity has so much to offer us. So listen to the Greeks, and then of course, whatever's sitting in front of you, just allow yourself to try to grasp the composition in big ways, in every related way. This to this, that to that. Busy areas talking to busy areas, darks talking to darks, rounds talking to rounds. Doesn't matter what it is. There's just so much for you to realize. Once you realize it, by the way, it goes way past realism. Would you believe the way I said that? No pun intended. Once you realize that, once you're there, in that sense that it's a composition, that everything is trying to be participating in the composition. As Degas said, every single thing you do you shouldn't be able to put it any other place if you've been paying attention compositionally. So I suppose there's more that we can say, but I think that gets the gist across. And if somebody wants to push on in a more narrowing direction, that would be fine with me. Yeah. So much fun to be had. So the impressionist is a searcher for composition in nature in front of him. He's searching for understanding about something that obviously has already got his attention. But it's not going to work out for you if you're not looking through that viewfinder that you start this whole thing with, Paul. It has to be related to the viewfinder, or it's not a composition. A composition is what happens within the rectangle. Okay? All right, that's it. I'm out of here. Thank you guys very much. Again, I'm going to pull some wonderful names up. Sometimes I remember your names, sometimes I don't as well. But Stephen J., thank you so much, and I do wish you well. Linda, Jen, Lauren K., and Adra B., thank you ever so much. This is so helpful to keep us moving. And I do, as I said, I hope it's always helpful to you all as well. Thank you all for your comments, Paul, this time, and for your subscribing, sharing, liking, all those things. Much appreciated. Yeah, I'm talking to Mr. Producer about producing a little bit of a demonstration for you, but I'm going to still try to get some other ones out as we speak, so to speak. Some ones that I've already done that have been recorded a little bit, and see if I can get more useful conversation to you. But Theodora is asking about flowers, so I am trying to do that. And I did start one, and I messed the whole thing up, not being good with the camera. So, all right. That's it. Have a great week.